What is the method of dialectical materialism? Last time we did one of these, we explored the dialectical materialist ontology, by which, of course, we mean how is it that Marxism views the way the world works? Central to that, we explored was the idea that the world is constantly changing, that everything is interconnected to everything else, that change is being driven by internal immanent contradictions, and that everything is situated in context. So the method is, of course, going to be connected to that ontological position that dialectical materialism or that Marxism has. It's going to necessarily imply that when we look at the world, if we try to separate things from their context, we're going to misunderstand them. If we try to ignore any sort of internal plurality and treat things as internally homogeneous and pure entities, we're going to misunderstand them. If we try to remove things from the ever evolving process in which they are embedded in, we're going to misunderstand them. So there's these sort of heuristic devices that we have to remember, which come from the way that we see the world working. And that's going to be central to the method. Central to the method is being able to look at the world and try to understand the things in it and how they exist in specific contexts and how they're constantly evolving. So looking at them from the standpoint of the trajectory that they're involved in, looking at the contradictions that situate that movement, that tension that drives the thing forward in interconnection to the external factors that condition the movement of the thing or process that you're studying. And also look at the general system, the totality, the whole that composes the context in which something is being investigated. Once you rip something apart from its context, which is the method of many of the dominant sciences, where you're literally dealing with a dead carcass in front of you that's completely separated from any semblance of the natural environment of the thing under study. And that's not to say, of course, that there isn't a place for studying things in that manner that could be incorporated into a larger, more dialectical and meaningful framework of investigation. But in general, we understand that once we divide things from their context, what we're studying is not something that is the thing. We've already performed a sort of epistemological violence on it by separating it from its natural habitat. And what we're studying is not the thing that we think that we're actually studying, or at least not in the way that it exists in a meaningful sense in the real world. So all of this is kept in mind in the Marxist method because it's correlated to how it is that we see the world functioning. Another central component to the Marxist method is what's called, in the more jargony way of expressing it, the ascension or the dialectical ascension from the abstract to the concrete. Let me break these two terms down in a very simple manner that I think is going to dispel the common sense or layman's way of understanding this. When we use the term abstract, we usually think about something being extremely theoretical and refined and difficult to understand. When someone says you're getting all abstract on me, that means that someone is talking about something that's so disconnected from the everyday forms of discourse that they're hard to even follow. Likewise, when someone says concrete, let's get concrete. I use this example with my students. Every time I bring up the word concrete, they want to start touching the tables and the stuff in front of them. It's almost as if the concrete is reduced to that which is simple and immediate and tangible. Now, etymologically, which is, I think, how it is that both Hegel and the tradition of Marxism treats these terms, abstract doesn't mean that, and concrete doesn't mean that. Abstract comes from abstractus, which refers to severing something, separating it out, removing it from its context. So treating it almost like a dead entity that's decontextualized. And concrete means that which contains many determination. It comes from concretus. And there's passages in both Hegel and Marx, in Hegel in his lectures on the history of philosophy, and in Marx in some of the introductory comments to the Grundrisse, where they quite literally say the same thing. The concrete is the unity of many determinations. Obviously, then the most concrete would be the whole, because that is what contains within it the most or all determinations. So, central to the Marxist method is this idea that if you want to understand the whole, so for Hegel, that would be the absolute idea. For Marx, that would be the capitalist form of life as a whole, the system. You can't just get at that whole directly. If you try to do that, you're going to engage with what Marx called an imagined concrete. You're only going to have the phantoms, the cosplaying of concrete reproduction of the concrete in your mind. You're actually going to deal with an abstract concrete. To get to the whole, you have to do it through the form of an ascension. You have to, what Marx called a concentration, which means that you have to start from an abstract starting point. So from something that you necessarily have to disconnect from the immediate interaction with the whole that we exist in order to begin to then reconstruct on a logical and necessary basis an order of categories that allows you to understand the whole. So this method is employed very clearly in Hegel's Science of Logic and also in Marx's Capital, because in a certain sense, it's the same method, except that the object of study of each is different. In Marx, for instance, you start with the commodity. The cell form, the germ of capitalist political economy. It's the most abstract category. And on that basis, you begin to reconstruct. You get to the different forms of value. You get to labor power. You get to surplus value, yada, yada, yada. And you keep going. And what ends up happening is that you are refining your categories. And every category that comes afterwards that's allowing you to have a more complex and concrete picture, that's allowing you to get closer to a concrete reproduction of the most concrete, which is the system as a whole. Every category, in order to really grasp it and understand it, needs to be seen in light of the previous category that you have just explained. You can't understand surplus value if you don't understand what labor power is. And that category is essential because that's how Marx closes out some of the dilemmas that arise out of classical political economy with Ricardo and Smith, etc. So every category that you build up has a logical importance to it. It's not just an arbitrary sequence, which at times there's comments that Engels makes in some of his letters that the order through which Hegel ascends in his logic seems to be somewhat arbitrary. For Marx, at least, that doesn't seem to be the case. You can't understand the later categories if you don't see them in light of the previous ones and how they develop into that. It also goes the other way around. If you don't understand what the earlier categories develop into and the later ones, you're going to fundamentally have a short sighted and perhaps even one sided understanding of some of the categories that evolve in the beginning. Let me give you a very practical example of what's at stake here. If you're watching a show and you only watch the last few episodes of it, are you going to have an understanding of what's going on? No, because in order to understand what's going on at the end, you have to see it in light of how it has been a development from the beginning, the middle, etc. If you only watch the beginning, of course, you're not going to know how it is that it ends. But if you watch the whole thing, not only do you get to understand the end of it because you've seen it in light of what has developed towards it, but you also get a better understanding of the beginning because you have seen what the beginning has led towards. This is why Schopenhauer said that all good books should be read twice, because the second time around is when you actually come to understand the beginning in light of the fact that you have read the whole book. So this is the theory of cognition, or the epistemology, or the method, whatever word you want to use, for Marxism, or the dialectical materialist worldview. And really at its core, it's about understanding that knowledge itself, like everything in the world, is a process. It's going to take refinement if you do it correctly. You can also go the other route and completely end up in even worse forms of misunderstanding. But a correct understanding of the world, a correct reproduction of the concrete in thought, as Lenin called it, requires this process of ascension, this process of refinement, of concretization, whatever word you want to use. They all mean basically the same thing.